I'm Dr. Roy William Maega. I'm a lecturer at Makerere University School of Public Health in the Department of Epidemiology and Biostatistics. I hold a basic degree in human medicine, a master's degree in public health, and a PhD in medical science. I'm going to talk to you about outbreaks and outbreak investigation. In the first part of this presentation, we are going to look at definitions related to outbreaks, trends in outbreaks, and determinants of outbreaks. Outbreaks are also synonymous with epidemics. The two words are used interchangeably. I would say outbreaks is like the layman's term for epidemics. These events are one of the most important events in the history and practice of epidemiology. A good part of epidemiology is built around outbreaks, and it's no surprise that the two share a name: epidemics, epidemiology. Outbreaks are also quite old in relation to the history of man. We have some modern outbreaks, outbreaks that are relatively recent, diseases like avian influenza, or what we call bird flu in the layman's terms, SARS, Ebola hemorrhagic fever and other hemorrhagic fevers, cholera, and sporadic outbreaks of sexually transmitted diseases. But also we know that in history, man has grappled a lot with outbreaks. If we look at the Black Death in Europe, what is also called plague, this was a very widespread problem in the Dark Ages Europe, taking so many lives. If we look at the history of cholera in London and how it devastated London for several decades, and how some of the fathers of epidemiology came out of that challenge. We can read about John Snow and his shoe leather epidemiology. So the outbreaks are also rooted in that history. But also way back in biblical times, we read about snake attacks and skin disease outbreaks and other outbreaks documented in various books, not only the Bible, but also other old manuscripts. And then the 10 outbreaks in Egypt and related challenges. So outbreaks have been with us. It's a key human challenge. But what really are outbreaks? What is an outbreak? What is an epidemic? An outbreak is defined as the occurrence of a disease or health-related event in excess of what is expected in terms of person, place, and time. Now, I'll emphasize some of these things. Now, when we say disease or health-related event, normally the term outbreaks is mostly used for disease, but it could be other health-related events that may not be disease. But it's more usual to use this term for negative events, not for positive events. For instance, if there's an outbreak of excess laughing in a particular school or institution among adolescents, so there's mass hysteria, so it tends to take a negative connotation. We may not say that there's an outbreak of good things, an outbreak of increased income, or an outbreak of sharing. So we may not use it for positive events. We usually use it for negative health-related events. But more importantly, it's the occurrence of these events in excess of what is expected. So if they occur as expected, then we don't say it's an outbreak. But once they occur beyond what is expected, and this is in terms of persons, like if there's a group of people who are not expected to get a particular disease, and yet you start getting those diseases, then we know that is an outbreak. Or a place. If a disease is not supposed to occur in a particular place, it's not expected to occur in a particular place, but then it occurs, then we talk about an outbreak. Or time. If in a particular season, we don't expect to get cases of a particular disease, and then we get it, then we start talking about an outbreak. So, when do we say there is an outbreak? We assess if the occurrence of the event, we count the events, and if it is occurring beyond what is expected for a particular population or a period of time or a place, then we say that there is an outbreak. So what is important is who is affected, that is the person, when are they affected, that is the time, and where are they affected, that is the place. So these three will tell us if the threshold is exceeded, then we say that there is an outbreak. Now, before we go much further, we would like to look at some terminologies and definitions related to outbreaks or indeed epidemics. And I would like to start with three important terms: epidemic, pandemic, and endemicity or endemic. Now, there are some diseases that are constantly with us. There are always some cases in the population to a certain level. If a disease exists at constant levels, whatever they may be, it may be 1% of the population at any one time or 10% of the population. So if there are always some cases in the population, then we describe that disease as endemic. And there are different levels of endemicity depending on what percentage of the population is affected. Let's take the example of malaria. Malaria is endemic here in Uganda. So we can describe it as holoendemic. Holoendemic meaning that a very large percentage of the population, probably over 90%, have some malaria parasites moving around in their blood at any one time, even if they don't have symptoms and signs of malaria. So we say it's holoendemic. And then hyperendemic, there is a certain threshold where a good majority of the population have malaria parasites, say over 70%. Then we say it is hyperendemic. And then mesoendemic is in the middle there. About a fair percentage of the population is moving with the parasites, while hypoendemic means a very small percentage of the population. Like, for instance, in the higher lands of southeastern Uganda, which is a mountainous area, you find that a very small proportion of the population, very small, is carrying malaria parasites. And indeed, as you go higher, there are some places in the mountains where almost none in the population is carrying any malaria parasites. So those are the levels of endemicity. Now, if an outbreak occurs in a given locality, so you exceed the expected number of cases, we call that an epidemic. Now, if epidemics occur in multiple geographical regions worldwide, so not only occurring in Uganda, but you find an epidemic, a similar epidemic, let's say cholera, happening in Kenya around the same time that it is happening in Uganda. And then maybe another one is in Southeast Asia, Sri Lanka, for instance. And then another one in another locality, say in West Africa. Then we begin to talk about a pandemic. A pandemic is an epidemic that has spread beyond geographical regions. A good example is the H1N1 epidemic, what the late man's term we used to call swine flu. This is an outbreak that started somewhere in Mexico. In a few weeks, it has spread to the United States of America, and then it flew to Europe, probably through air travel, and then to Africa. And indeed, Uganda was also affected because a secondary school in Bushenyi was affected around the same time. So we talk about a pandemic. Now, there are other important definitions. Now, some definitions arise from diseases affecting animals. The importance of this is that there has been a realization that many of the new deadly infectious diseases that are occurring in recent times are coming from animals. So that's why it is important to also know these definitions. There are new epidemics that cause outbreaks both in animals and in human beings. And so the animal health has become an important issue in human public health. And that is why these days we talk about the One Health approach, that we need to look at this as a joint issue, because some of these diseases in animals are affecting humans. Now, a zoonosis is a disease or infection that is naturally transmitted between animals and man. It's not artificially, but naturally. It can move from an animal to man, but also vice versa. Man can also infect the animal. Examples of the common zoonoses, we talk about brucellosis, we talk about Rift Valley fever, we talk about rabies, anthrax, plague, trypanosomiasis or sleeping sickness, influenza, Ebola, and Marburg. Now, related terms, an epizootic is an outbreak or an epidemic of disease in animals. If there's an outbreak of a certain disease in animals, we call it an epizootic. Remember, in humans, we called it epidemic. Here, it's called epizootic. Now, enzootic is a disease that is endemic in animals. It's occurring there's a constant percentage of animals that have that disease. So we have some diseases that are endemic in animals, like brucellosis, diseases like rabies. There's always a percentage of animals that have them in certain localities. And then we talk about panzootic. Panzootic, this term is not included here, but a panzootic is a pandemic of a zoonotic epidemic. So a zoonotic epidemic occurring in multiple localities worldwide. Now, we also talk about exotic diseases. These are diseases that are imported into a country in which they did not previously occur. An example is bird flu. It did not occur in Uganda, but it was imported. And then an epizoonotic disease. This is not a very international term, but it is a term that has been coined by our own epidemiologists in the School of Public Health to refer to an epidemic-prone zoonosis, a zoonotic disease that is epidemic-prone. We may refer to it in this particular session as an epizoonotic disease. Now, which are some of the epidemic-prone diseases in Uganda? We have diarrheal diseases, including the commonest, which is acute watery diarrhea, but we also have cholera, we have dysentery, we have typhoid. So these are likely to occur in many districts in Uganda. But we also have immunizable diseases, diseases that can be prevented through immunization, but they cause outbreaks. So we need to immunize massively to be able to prevent these diseases. Examples is measles, we have diphtheria, we have diseases like whooping cough, which are epidemic-prone immunizable diseases. Now, malaria is endemic in most parts of East Africa. So it's difficult to say that there's an epidemic of malaria because it's constantly there. But epidemics of malaria can also occur if what is expected, the expected prevalence, is far exceeded. Then we can say there's an epidemic of malaria. As you can see there, there's a long list of epidemic-prone diseases in Uganda, from acute watery diarrhea, cholera, dysentery, measles, meningococcal meningitis. Uganda is one of the countries that lie in the meningitis belt. The meningitis belt is a belt of countries is a belt of countries within a certain latitude where we get many outbreaks of meningitis. We also have plague in Uganda. Is quite a big problem in the West Nile districts. We have rabies, we have yellow fever, influenza viruses, hepatitis E and B, viral hemorrhagic fevers, Ebola, Marburg, Crimean Congo. So there are quite a number of them. Onyong-nyong, quite a number of them. And most of them are emerging diseases. We have Zika virus, Rift Valley fever, foodborne outbreaks like botulism, chemical poisoning. Psychiatric conditions can also occur in outbreaks, like you can get mass hysteria. We have cases where entire schools are affected by abnormal symptoms in young children, probably related to stress and other conditions in the schools. We have outbreaks of neurological conditions like epidemic nodding, or what is commonly called nodding disease, which is currently a problem in northern Uganda, and for which a cause is difficult, has not been well articulated, but is currently strongly linked to the distribution of a certain parasite called Onchocerca volvulus, which causes some calcifications in the brain leading to epilepsy and epilepsy-like symptoms. The problem with these particular children is that the trigger for their epilepsy, in epilepsy we usually have a trigger that causes convulsions. The trigger for their epilepsy is usually the sight of food. So when they see food, they start developing that kind of manifestation of nodding, and they therefore tend to be very undernourished and they appear much smaller for age than expected. So those are some of the new challenges. This disease has caused related syndromes in the past in Uganda among Congolese refugees in the Albertine region, where it caused them malformations in their brain, and they used to have short stature with relatively big heads, and it was called the Nakalanga syndrome. But it's also seen distributed in other areas that have faced complex emergencies. Northern Uganda, you know, the 20-year civil war, but it has also been observed in places like Sierra Leone, which also faced a long-term complex emergency. Now, the same condition has been associated with the places where there have been chemical dumps, chemical waste, especially from munition dumped. An example is in New York, where the similar syndrome was seen in young children. So there are quite a number of associated factors, but in Uganda, it seems to be related to the distribution of Onchocerca volvulus, which is the same as river blindness. But there are also many more epidemic-prone diseases. Now, there's what we call emerging and re-emerging epidemic-prone diseases. Diseases are epidemic-prone diseases that are caused by totally new or partially new agents, usually referred to as emerging epidemic-prone diseases, while those that are caused by known organisms, but they are increasing, they are coming back again after having been previously controlled, are usually called re-emerging. And we have some examples of new agents. Ebola is new, probably not older than 1970. SARS, Zika, pandemic influenzas. Some of the pandemic influenzas are relatively new. They just emerged within the previous century. But we also have re-emerging ones, things that had been controlled in the past but seem to be coming back. For example, TB, which we know is re-emerging because of HIV/AIDS. We know that cholera is re-emerging. So we have many outbreaks, even here in Uganda. We've had so many outbreaks of cholera. We have syphilis, hepatitis E. Hepatitis E had disappeared from Uganda and last occurred, I think, in the 60s. But recently, we got some outbreaks in northern Uganda, closely related to the recovery from the long-term conflict. So you see that complex emergencies are a key factor in re-emergence of outbreaks. Yellow fever, but also massive chemical poisoning. We've heard of outbreaks of alcohol poisoning in especially Kenya with the illicit brew called changa, but also occurring here in Uganda. So these are some of the re-emerging ones. And most new outbreaks are zoonotics. It is estimated that over the last 30 years, there have been 20 new diseases, completely brand new diseases affecting human beings and causing outbreaks. So you can see that as we strive to control the existing burden of disease, new diseases are coming in. And 2/3 of the new disease agents that we are seeing are coming from wildlife. 2/3 of the new diseases are coming from wildlife. Talk about Ebola, talk about SARS, talk about Nipah virus, talk about H5N1, that is bird flu, talk about H1N1, which was also coined the term swine flu, and talk about monkeypox. The picture there is a young guy with the monkeypox from the Democratic Republic of Congo. So you see, smallpox was eradicated in 1980, but now we are getting new diseases. Now, domestic animals account for about 20% of new zoonotic diseases that attack human beings. Now, the East Africa region and Central Africa are a hotspot for new diseases. There's a concept of hotspots. Where are these new diseases coming from? And epidemiological patterns across the world show that most of the new diseases are emerging from the large river basins. There's a hotspot around the Congo River Basin and the Great Lakes region. So that is one hotspot. But another hotspot is the Amazon Basin. And then you have Southeast Asia along the major rivers of Southeast Asia, where we are also seeing that there are hotspots for emergence of new diseases. And they could be geographic hotspots. They could be high-risk populations there, high-risk host species like bats and monkeys distributed there. These are the species where these organisms first incubate and grow before they learn to infect human beings. And some of these species are very effective in hosting these agents. Like we know that some of the monkeys and some of the bats have Ebola endemic in them, but they don't get sick. So they provide a good opportunity for maintaining these viruses as these viruses learn how to attack human beings. And probably what I also need to mention is that most of these agents are what we call RNA viruses. So they are very basic viruses. Now, what are some of the factors promoting the increased occurrence of deadly epidemics? Some of them intuitive. Population pressure. The increasing, very rapid rise in the population, leading to a pressure on natural resources. But more importantly, making it easier for an infected person to get into contact with a non-infected person. Increased climate variability due to climate change. It is changing the ecosystems where these viruses are and making them more favorable to live in other areas where they did not live. Environmental degradation and pollution. Human activities, including interaction with animals. Humans are increasingly interacting with animals. The pressure for resources means that humans have to look for new sources of food. So consumption of primates, interaction with forests where they find the birds and those other issues. Urbanization is another key issue. Rapid urbanization, which leads to high population density. Migration is very important. It's becoming an important public health issue, as you know what is happening globally now due to the conflicts everywhere. People migrate, they carry diseases. Natural disasters, technological disasters, especially complex emergencies that involve displacement of people, people living in camps, concentrated populations, high population pressure, and associated challenges. One thing that we didn't include here is improved and easy international travel. The aircraft are now moving everywhere and carrying with them so many infectious agents that previously were not easy to transport. Now, what is promoting the emergence of epizoonotic diseases, those diseases that are connected to human beings? There are socioeconomic factors like intensive farming without looking at biosecurity. People with 10,000, 100,000 chickens, several thousands of cattle, but not paying attention to biosecurity. Water supply projects, urbanization, human population movement, animal movement, famine, drought, dry spells, free-range farming systems where animals move everywhere and like birds can interact with wild migratory birds. Environmental factors like climate change, presence of vectors and reservoirs. but also human-related factors like co-infection with other diseases like HIV and how it is promoting TB. Lack of knowledge on how to prevent these diseases, but also personal hygiene. But also cultural factors like lack of knowledge, food habits, changes in lifestyle, human-livestock wild-style interaction. Now, let's examine a little bit closer the human-animal interface. What is happening there? How are humans transacting with animals? We have people who engage in intense handling of animal products with low biosecurity measures. They are not putting on anything. Just visit a chicken stall in a market and you see what is going on in some of the markets, including the cross-border markets like in West Nile. Diseases like brucellosis, anthrax, avian influenza. Then pastoralism and free-range systems make it possible for diseases like Rift Valley fever and flu to move. Hunting, gathering, there are still some populations involved in hunting and gathering and eating of game meat and carcasses, dead carcasses, which exposes human beings to viral hemorrhagic fevers and anthrax. Contact with bats and primates in forests by hunters and gatherers, and in bat-infected caves by tourists. We are seeing viral hemorrhagic fevers. Tourists getting Marburg disease from visiting some caves that are infested with bats. Ill-cooked products like leading to salmonellosis and brucellosis. Household hygiene and rats contributing to diseases like leptospirosis, hepatitis E, but also diseases like plague. Deforestation and farming at the edges of forests and wildlife zones. People are cutting forests to get new farmland, but also interacting with the primates and bats. Free-range poultry systems and migratory birds. East Africa is a good nesting site for most of these birds that are running away from the winter, and after that they go back, carrying some of them carrying diseases back and forth. There are populations which stay in conservation areas. Like these are areas around national parks that have been gazetted for human beings to stay together with animals. A good example is Ngorongoro and Samburu conservation areas in Tanzania, and these are closely associated with Rift Valley fever. Ill handling of domestic canines, which is promoting rabies. Socio-cultural factors, including the funny practice of sharing accommodation with animals. Cross-border risk, porous borders. If you went to West Nile, you'll see that Uganda's border is very porous, things moving in and out, no biosecurity, but also gender-related risk, as we shall talk about later. Occupational exposure, especially leading to diseases like brucellosis and bovine tuberculosis. Now, very quickly, there are some conceptual, some concepts underlying outbreaks. One of them is herd immunity. Herd immunity refers to immunity that is given to the whole population when a critical percentage of the population is immunized. There's a certain threshold when, for a particular disease, when you immunize most people and you reach that threshold, the rest of the non-immunized people are protected from acquiring the disease because the probability of getting into contact with an infected person becomes very low. For example, the threshold for measles is about 85%. Once 85% of the population is covered, the rest of the 15% are nearly protected from measles outbreaks because it's difficult for a person with the disease to find one who is not immunized. So that is one concept. Another one is the causal web concept. This one simply means that unlike the biomedical models that link disease to a particular causative agent, either a virus or a bacteria or a fungus, in public health, we say that disease is caused by a layer of factors. So it's not only the organism, but there are several other factors. Like, for instance, how do we greet people? How do we wash hands? So hygiene factors, sanitation, water, access to this, access to health services. all these come into play. So we have some immediate causes, we have proximate causes, and then we have underlying causes like poverty, like housing conditions and those. So these factors are linked in a complex web, and it is not just that to get cholera, you have to eat Vibrio cholerae. It has to be an interplay of factors. You may eat Vibrio cholerae, but you don't get cholera, maybe because of several other factors, your immune status and other things. Now, the other concept I want to talk about is the concept of the reproductive ratio, or also termed as R0. R0 means the average number of people that one infected person infects before they are either cured or they die. That number is very important in the spread of outbreaks. If on average, each infected person infects more than one person, then you get an outbreak. But if on average, each infected person infects one person, then the disease remains endemic. If on average, each infected person infects less than one person, and you would ask, how can that happen? Like for every 2 people you infect one person, then the disease outbreak reduces drastically and the disease disappears. This leads to control or elimination or eradication of that particular disease. This is an example of some R0s for different diseases. On average, a person with hepatitis C may infect about 2 people. A person with Ebola may infect 2 people, although we saw that in Sierra Leone and West Africa, the 3 countries, Liberia, Sierra Leone, and and Guinea, this ratio was far exceeded. Some people, that's why the epidemic went way out of control. But there are factors that were responsible for that. HIV, in some situations where HIV is quite a big problem, HIV, one infected person may infect 4 people. SARS, one infected person may infect 4 people. You can see that for mumps, one infected person can infect 10 people. And for measles, one person can infect about 18 people. So those are quite very rapidly spreading diseases. Now, the last aspect I wanted to touch on in this subsession is the issue of control, elimination, and eradication of disease. By eradication, we mean that there are no new cases of a disease globally or in a given locality. No new cases of a particular disease. But even the prevalent cases, those which are used to have the disease in the population, have disappeared. No new cases, no prevalent cases. So one disease has successfully been eradicated like that, and that is smallpox. And polio is on the path to being eradicated. Although some countries have had sporadic outbreaks here and there, it's on the path to eradication. If we can all work together, we can eradicate a second disease in the history of man. Now, elimination means there are no new cases of a disease occurring globally or in a particular locality, but some prevalent cases still exist. It means these prevalent cases can cause an outbreak if we are not careful. So when a disease is eliminated, it means it's on the path to eradication. But we cannot say it's eradicated because there are still a few lingering old cases that could infect. An example is guinea worm and onchocerciasis. Now, control means we are not yet there. We are not yet eliminating the disease. There are still new cases, but the disease is controlled at a certain level of prevalence. An example is malaria. We can control malaria, and we can control trypanosomiasis or sleeping sickness. So this is the first part.